In 1945, one of the most expensive construction projects in South American history changed hands for roughly $250,000. No inventory was filed. No decommissioning report was written. The American crew left, and the record more or less stopped keeping up. In the summer of 1927, Henry Ford received a land concession from the Brazilian state of Pará, covering nearly 2.5 million acres of Amazon rainforest along the Tapajos River. The terms were generous, almost unusually so. Brazil wanted American investment, American infrastructure, and American employment methods brought into its interior. Ford wanted rubber, independent of the British-controlled Southeast Asian markets that had been squeezing his supply chain for years. The agreement suited both parties on paper, and within months the first ships loaded with equipment, prefabricated materials, and American workers were already moving south. The site chosen for the settlement was a broad bend in the Tapajos, roughly 600 miles inland from the Atlantic coast. There were no roads connecting it to any major Brazilian city. Supply lines ran entirely by river. The first workers to arrive found dense forest, equatorial heat, and a mosquito population that no one had adequately prepared for. They began clearing land anyway, because the schedule demanded it, and because Ford's organization did not budget time for second thoughts. What emerged from that clearing over the following years was genuinely strange, by any measure. Fordlandia was not a work camp or a plantation outpost. It had a main street. It had a water tower, a power plant, a hospital with surgical facilities, a school that taught in English, a golf course, and dozens of identical white houses arranged in careful rows on graded lots. American supervisors lived in slightly larger houses on slightly higher ground. Brazilian workers lived in separate quarters closer to the river. The physical layout encoded a hierarchy that nobody needed to explain out loud. Ford himself designed several elements of the town remotely, from Michigan, based on his belief that the right environment produced the right kind of worker. There were rules against alcohol, which led to a thriving black market on the river. There were rules about diet. Ford had strong opinions about nutrition, which meant that Brazilian laborers accustomed to local food were served American-style meals they largely did not want. A commissary sold approved goods. The workday followed a schedule written for a temperate climate, with midday shifts during the peak Amazon heat that left men exhausted before afternoon. The rubber trees themselves were the central problem, and it was one that Ford's planners had been warned about before the first seed went into the ground. Wild Amazonian rubber trees grew naturally dispersed across vast areas, separated by other species, which limited the spread of the fungal leaf blight that attacked them. Planted in close agricultural rows, as Ford's operation required, they became ideal conditions for the blight to move from tree to tree unchecked. Early harvests fell far short of projections. Agronomists brought in to assess the situation recommended changes. Most of those recommendations were reviewed, discussed, and not implemented quickly enough to matter. By 1930, the situation at Fordlandia became hard to manage. Disagreements about food work hours and supervisor actions caused unrest. The dining hall was affected. Items were moved. Local police helped bring calm. Ford's company noted the event, filed reports, and kept working. Official letters from that time were careful and steady, the words of men writing for records, not for clear truth. Ford did not visit Fordlandia. This fact is documented and was noted even at the time as unusual for a man of his involvement. He received regular reports through intermediaries, reviewed the figures, and on at least one occasion expressed confidence that the operation would eventually succeed if properly managed. His son Edsel, who had broader oversight of international operations, visited briefly in the early 1930s and reportedly found conditions better than reports had suggested. Whether that assessment was accurate or simply diplomatic is not recorded with any clarity. By 1934, A second plantation site called Belterra was established roughly 75 miles south of Fordlandia on slightly higher ground better suited to rubber cultivation. Resources and personnel were partially redirected there. Fordlandia continued operating in a reduced capacity, though the term reduced is relative. The town itself remained inhabited, the hospital kept functioning, the school stayed open. The infrastructure Ford had built was too substantial to simply walk away from, even as the economic case for the entire operation grew weaker each season. Stop transcription here. The leaf blight did not distinguish between sites. Belterra suffered the same fungal spread that had compromised Fordlandia, though it took longer to reach the same level of damage. By the early 1940s, wartime synthetic rubber production in the United States had begun to reduce the strategic importance of natural rubber entirely. The original justification for the Amazon operation, supply chain independence, was becoming obsolete as chemistry caught up with logistics. Ford's rubber empire in the jungle had been expensive, difficult, culturally damaging, and was now also unnecessary. In 1945, negotiations between the Ford Motor Company and the Brazilian federal government concluded with a sale. The entire operation, both sites, all structures, all equipment, all remaining inventory, transferred to Brazilian ownership for approximately $250,000. The original investment has been estimated at between $7 and $20 million, depending on the source and what costs are included. The gap between those two numbers is not a rounding error. It is the financial record of something that failed completely, sold for what the other party was willing to offer rather than what it was worth. What the Brazilian government received in that transfer, and what it then did with it, is where the documentation becomes difficult to follow. There is no single comprehensive inventory of the structures, equipment, and land that changed hands in 1945. State-level records in Para reference the transfer without detailing it. Federal documentation acknowledges ownership without describing the site's condition or outlining any plan for its use. The paperwork exists in pieces, across multiple archives, with gaps between entries that span years. Fordlandia had been one of the most expensive private construction projects ever undertaken in South America. After 1945, it appears in the official record the way a footnote appears in a document, present, but no longer the point. The river does not give much away. It moves past Fordlandia the same way it always has, wide, brown, and indifferent to whatever stands on its banks. But if you arrive by boat and look carefully at the waterline, you can still see where the old dock pylons were sunk into the riverbed. They are still there. Nobody removed them. Nobody filed a report explaining why they were left. In the years immediately following the 1945 transfer, the Brazilian government made no public announcement about its plans for the site. This was not unusual in itself. Large administrative transfers often moved slowly through bureaucratic channels before any practical decision was reached. What is unusual is that the silence continued. No development proposal was formally submitted. No demolition order was issued. No resettlement program was organized for the Brazilian workers and their families who had remained on site after the American personnel departed. The town simply continued existing under new ownership, with no clear instructions attached. Some workers stayed. This is documented in regional accounts and in the recollections of residents from nearby river communities, though the number is difficult to verify precisely. They remained not because anyone told them to, but because they had nowhere obvious to go. The houses were still standing. The water system still functioned. The hospital had not been emptied. Leaving required resources and a destination, and for many families who had relocated to Fordlandia from distant Brazilian states during the Ford years, neither of those things was easily available in 1945. The machinery presents its own category of questions. Ford's operation had imported substantial industrial equipment, generators, processing machinery, Vehicles, tools, much of it expensive and purpose-built for the plantation's specific operations. After the transfer, some of this equipment was reportedly moved. Regional records reference machinery shipments leaving the Tapajos in the late 1940s, though the destinations are not consistently documented. What remained at the site, and what was determined to have no further use, appears to have been left in place rather than catalogued and formally disposed of. The distinction matters, because equipment that is abandoned differs legally and administratively from equipment that is written off and recorded as such. Photographs taken by travelers and researchers who visited Fordlandia in the 1950s and 1960s show a town in uneven decay. Some structures remained largely intact. Others had begun collapsing under the weight of humidity and vegetation. The water tower, a large American-style tank on a steel frame, was still standing. The main street was still identifiable. Jungle growth had reclaimed some of the cleared land at the edges, but the central area of the town retained its basic shape. These photographs exist in personal collections and in a small number of Brazilian academic publications, but they were not the product of any official documentation effort. No government photographer was sent. No architectural survey was commissioned. Brazilian geographic and cartographic agencies produced several regional surveys of the Para interior during the late 1940s and 1950s. Fordlandia appears in some of these, referenced by name and location. But the level of detail applied to the site is inconsistent when compared to other settled areas of similar size. In some editions, it is marked as a populated place. In others, the same marking is absent. The classification shifts without explanation between survey cycles, which is the kind of inconsistency that typically reflects either incomplete fieldwork or uncertain administrative status. And in Fordlandia's case, the administrative status was genuinely uncertain, because no one had formally resolved what the site was supposed to be. The question of land title adds another layer to the record's confusion. The 1945 transfer conveyed ownership to the Brazilian federal government, but the specific legal instruments governing what could be done with the land afterward were not immediately clear. Brazilian land law in the Amazon during this period was itself in a transitional state, with overlapping jurisdictions between federal, state, and municipal authorities that created frequent ambiguity about who held effective authority over a given area. Fordlandia sat within this ambiguity for years. Decisions that required clear title could not be made until title was clarified. And clarifying title required administrative attention that was apparently directed elsewhere. By the 1960s, the Brazilian interior was the subject of significant government interest, but that interest was focused on new development rather than existing sites. The military government that took power in 1964 pursued ambitious infrastructure and settlement programs in the Amazon, including the Trans-Amazon Highway Project and a series of colonization initiatives that drew settlers into previously undeveloped areas. Fordlandia, already developed and already inhabited on a small scale, did not fit neatly into these programs. It was not new enough to serve as a demonstration project, and not significant enough to warrant special treatment. It remained in the background of the archive, noted but not acted upon. A small permanent community had established itself at the site by this period. Descendants of workers from the Ford era, along with a modest number of newer arrivals, had continued living in the remaining structures and farming the land around the town. They had done so without formal land grants, without utility contracts in the conventional sense, and without any documented relationship to the federal government that nominally owned the ground beneath their houses. This is not an unusual situation in remote Amazonian communities, but it is a situation that creates exactly the kind of administrative ambiguity that makes historical reconstruction difficult. There are people in the records, but their legal status on the land is never plainly stated. Researchers and journalists who began visiting Fordlandia more regularly from the 1980s onward found a place that defied easy categorization. It was not a ruin in the conventional sense. Too much was still standing, still functional in basic ways, still inhabited. It was not a preserved historic site. Nothing had been formally protected, documented, or interpreted for visitors. It was not a functioning settlement in any administratively recognized form. It occupied a category that Brazilian bureaucracy did not appear to have a standard term for, a place that had happened, that continued to exist physically, and that the official record had never quite decided what to do with. The water tower became a recurring image in accounts from this period. Writers and photographers arriving by riverboat consistently noted it as the first recognizable landmark, visible above the tree line before the town itself came into view, its steel frame rusted but intact, the tank at its top still holding its shape against the sky. It had been built to serve a city of thousands, and now stood over a village of a few hundred. No maintenance record for it exists in any archive that has been publicly examined. It had simply continued standing, the way things continue standing when no one has ordered them taken down, and the structure itself has not yet decided to fall. What the archive does not contain is in some ways more informative than what it does. There is no decommissioning report for Fordlandia. There is no formal abandonment declaration. There is no environmental assessment of the site following the industrial operations. There is no consolidated record of what equipment remained after the transfer, what became of it, and who made the decisions about its disposition. These are not unusual omissions for a remote site in mid-20th century Brazil. Record-keeping in the Amazon interior during this period was inconsistent across the board. But the scale of what is missing is proportional to the scale of what was built. And what was built was enormous. $20 million of American industrial infrastructure does not typically disappear from the administrative record without leaving more of a trace than Fordlandia left. The Tapajos move slowly at Fordlandia. In the dry season, the water level drops enough to expose stretches of pale riverbank that are underwater for the rest of the year, and the pylons of the old Ford dock stand fully visible, dark wood against pale sand, preserved by the same tannic river water that has stained them the color of old leather. Local fishermen pass them without much attention. They have always been there, as far as anyone currently living in the town can remember. The question of who is responsible for them, who owns them, who would be liable if one failed, has never been publicly answered. Fordlandia today has a population of roughly 2,000 people, depending on the source and the year of the estimate. It functions as a small river municipality, with a school, a health post, and a regular boat service connecting it to larger towns downstream. Some of the original Ford-era structures are still in use, repurposed, modified, patched with whatever materials were available at the time of each repair. Others have been left to the jungle, which in the Amazon does not wait long before asserting its claim. The boundary between the inhabited town and the encroaching forest shifts slightly every season, and no formal survey of that boundary appears to have been conducted in recent years. The old hospital building has been one of the more frequently photographed structures in recent decades. Its exterior walls are still largely intact, though the interior has been stripped over time. Fixtures removed, flooring worn through, the roof compromised in sections by water damage and vegetation. It was built to serve the medical needs of a plantation workforce numbering in the thousands. It is now too large for the community that surrounds it, and too deteriorated for any straightforward reuse. It stands as a kind of architectural record of a scale of ambition that the place never again approached after 1945. Brazilian journalist and researcher Greg Grandin published a detailed history of Fordlandia in 2009, drawing on archives in both the United States and Brazil. His research documented the Ford Motor Company records extensively, tracking the internal correspondence, the financial projections, and the operational decisions that shaped the plantation's trajectory. What his work also made visible through the process of reconstruction was how incomplete the Brazilian side of the record remained. The American archive was detailed because Ford's organization was meticulous about documentation. The Brazilian Federal Archive for the post-1945 period was thinner, less organized, and in some areas simply absent. The asymmetry itself became part of the story. The Ford Motor Company's own records, held at the Benson Ford Research Center in Michigan, contain detailed documentation of the Amazon operation through 1945. Construction costs, personnel rosters, agricultural reports, correspondence between Dearborn and the Tapajos. The American side of the operation was documented with the thoroughness of a major corporate enterprise, because that is what it was. The moment of transfer in 1945 is documented in those records as well. The terms, the payment, the signatures. What happens after the last American signature is the point at which the Ford archive closes and the Brazilian archive should open. The handoff between those two bodies of documentation is where the gap lives. Satellite imagery of Fordlandia, available through commercial mapping services, shows the town's footprint clearly. The grid of streets laid out by Ford's engineers is still legible from above, straighter and more regular than the organic growth patterns of most Amazonian river settlements. The water tower is visible. The larger structures show as distinct shapes among the canopy. The cleared agricultural land from the plantation era has been partially reclaimed by secondary forest growth, which from above looks similar to primary forest but is ecologically distinct. A difference invisible to casual observation, but significant to anyone tracking land use history. The land remembers what was done to it, even when the documents do not. Visitors who have reached Fordlandia by river in recent years describe a place that produces a specific and difficult to articulate feeling. The town is inhabited and functional in basic ways, but the scale of what was built relative to what remains in use creates a persistent sense of disproportion. Door frames built for a different era. Streets wider than the traffic that uses them. A power infrastructure designed for industrial capacity now serving domestic needs. The physical environment communicates something about ambition and failure and time that the documentary record, with all its gaps, cannot fully convey. The buildings say something the paperwork does not. The question of what Fordlandia actually is, administratively and legally, was partially addressed in subsequent decades as Brazilian municipal organization in the Amazon developed. The site was incorporated into the municipality of Aveiro, the nearest administrative center of any size. This gave it a formal address, a place in census records, and a relationship to municipal services. But incorporation into Aveiro did not resolve the underlying questions about the Ford-era structures. Who owns them in a specific legal sense? What obligations that ownership carries? And what, if anything, should be done with buildings that are simultaneously historical artifacts and deteriorating liabilities? Those questions have not been answered with any document that is publicly available. There have been periodic proposals over the years to develop Fordlandia as a heritage tourism site. The idea is not without logic. The history is genuinely remarkable, the physical remains are substantial, and the river journey required to reach the site has its own atmospheric quality that fits a certain kind of travel. Some of these proposals appear in Brazilian news archives from the 1990s and 2000s. None of them progressed to any documented implementation stage. The reasons given in various accounts include funding constraints, jurisdictional complexity, and the logistical difficulty of developing infrastructure in a site accessible only by river. The proposals came and went without leaving much behind in the record, which is perhaps appropriate for a place defined by that quality. What makes Fordlandia persistently interesting to researchers and historians is not simply that it failed. Large, ambitious projects fail regularly, and their failures are usually well documented. Postmortems are filed, Lessons are recorded. The institutional memory is preserved, even when it is embarrassing. What makes Fordlandia unusual is the quality of the silence that followed. The American record closes cleanly in 1945. The Brazilian record opens incompletely and never fully catches up. In between those two bodies of documentation is a period of years during which one of the largest construction projects in South American history was transferring from one owner to another. And the paper trail for that transition has never been consolidated into any single coherent account. The rusting machinery at the edge of town, the processing equipment, the vehicle frames, the industrial components left in place after 1945 has never been formally inventoried in any document that researchers have been able to locate. Some pieces have been removed over the decades, by whom and for what purpose is not consistently recorded. Some remain. A traveler who visited in the early 2000s described seeing what appeared to be a Ford-era vehicle chassis, partly submerged in vegetation at the edge of the cleared area, visible from the path but not easily reachable. Whether it was documented, whether it is still there, whether anyone has formal responsibility for it, none of those questions have clean answers. The water tower is still standing. As of the most recent documented accounts, it remains the tallest structure in Fordlandia, visible from the river, rusted but intact. It was built to last, the way things were built when the assumption was that the operation beneath it would also last. That assumption proved wrong about almost everything, but the tower remains. There is no maintenance log for it that anyone has produced. There is no inspection record. There is no document assigning responsibility for what happens when it eventually comes down. It stands over the town the way the whole history of the place stands, present, unresolved, and not yet fully accounted for. Some records are gone because they were not made. Some are gone because they were misplaced. Some are gone because the groups in charge of making them had little money, few workers, or other priorities. And some are gone for reasons that do not fit those explanations neatly. Fordlandia is strange without needing a secret plan. It only needs looking at. The empty space in the records is real. The buildings are real. The water tower is real. What is not real, or not yet written down, is any full story of what happened to all of it, from the last American signature in 1945 until now. That story has not been written. It may not be possible to write it. The record, wherever it is, has not yet been found. The file on Fordlandia has never been officially closed, because it was never officially opened in any comprehensive sense. Somewhere between a Michigan boardroom and a Brazilian riverbank, the accounting stopped. The buildings did not. They are still there, holding their shape against the jungle, waiting for a document that has not arrived in 80 years and may never come.